So one thing I want you to understand about the Vietnam War is it didn't look like most wars previously fought by the United States. When people study World War I or World War II, they often look at maps that show the front lines where major battles are taking place, and people can get a sense of who was winning the war based upon who was holding what territory. But there really were no front lines in this war. Now, the United States has to, in Vietnam, figure out how they're going to fight an entirely different kind of war amongst a population that is at best marginally supportive of the South Vietnamese government that we were there to defend. While at the same time, we're also supposed to be defending the South Vietnamese people, many of whom don't trust the United States' presence there. So, how exactly did they fight the war? What were the tactics? The map that you see there, especially in red, is a map of what was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is not a singular item, it's not the Gateway Trail. Instead, it was more of an idea about how exactly the South Vietnamese guerrillas, the Viet Cong, they were getting men and supplies with which they were able to then conduct attacks and raids in South Vietnam. So one of the initial tactics following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was Operation Rolling Thunder, which was a massive, massive bombing campaign between 1965 and 1968. And there were two primary goals. The first was to try to cut off those supply routes, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and also targeting North Vietnam itself. Again, keep in mind, the goal here in the Vietnam War is not to overthrow the North Vietnamese government. The goal is to contain communism in North Vietnam, to defend the South Vietnamese government. So when I say that this was a massive bombing campaign, the United States dropped more bombs in Vietnam than we dropped in Europe as a whole during all of World War II. So again, this is a limited war in some sense because we were not attempting to overthrow the North Vietnamese government, but in terms of the firepower that we used, it was definitely not limited. So beyond the bombing campaign, how exactly was the United States conducting warfare if there were no front lines? Well, one of the tactics was called search and destroy. If you get outside of the cities in South Vietnam is marked by very mountainous regions, a lot of jungles, a lot of rural areas. And so search and destroy, this tactic implied that American troops in very small squads would be sent out on missions to try to locate Viet Cong or Viet Minh in jungle or mountain regions. And once identifying them, then they could call in U.S. air power to attack those sites. What you ended up with were American troops who essentially were sent out on patrols again and again, hoping merely to run into the enemy. While this certainly has some tactical effectiveness, it definitely played a significant role in some of the morale amongst American soldiers who were being sent out to hopefully run into the enemy on a regular basis. Now, one of the challenges for the United States was we weren't just trying to defeat a military, we were trying to build support for a South Vietnamese government. So we also instituted what was called the winning of hearts and minds. And this was an attempt to try to win over the South Vietnamese population, especially by trying to develop the local economy, to try to build up the institutions of South Vietnam so eventually it would be self-supporting. So to support democracy, to support free markets. Now, at the same time that the United States was trying to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese population, we were also conducting what was a tactic that was called pacification. One of the questions had always been, where exactly are the Viet Cong in South Vietnam operating out of? And the United States military and the South Vietnamese military understood that they were using small rural villages as bases of operations, often without the consent of those villagers, but at the same time that the United States was trying to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese population, the United States military was also conducting what was called pacification. The United States military and the South Vietnamese military understood that often the Viet Cong were using South Vietnamese villages as base camps. So in order to deny them the ability to have a base of operations, sometimes this meant that the United States military would destroy villages, would destroy crops, would often relocate villagers from their homes to be able to deny the Viet Cong a base of operations. Some people look at these concurrent strategies of winning of hearts and minds and pacification as a little bit counterproductive. Again, the act of burning down crops or burning down villages was very unlikely to win anybody's hearts or anybody's minds. Beyond the tactics that were used by the United States to try to win the war that made Americans question our behavior during the war, the United States government was digging its own problem by creating what was called a credibility gap, a difference between what the United States government was telling the public about Vietnam and what the American public increasingly was finding out about what was actually going on there, especially from 1968 onwards. We're going to look now at a couple of different things that led to this idea of a credibility gap. And we're going to start with this concept of body counts. As stated before, this was not a traditional war like World War I or World War II, where somebody could look at a map to identify which side is winning or losing. That simply didn't apply here. So, to demonstrate the idea of success, the United States military began using the number of people killed to sell the war in a sense. So on a regular basis, they would publish how many North Vietnamese were killed, how many South Vietnamese, how many American deaths there were, with the implication being that the more North Vietnamese that were killed, the better the United States must be doing. The problem with this is the United States military itself began finding that a lot of their own numbers were inflated, often to justify their actions, to justify their behavior. And on a bigger concern, they began to find instances in which American soldiers, to try to demonstrate more success, would go out of their way to try to cause actual more death. It's a practice that the United States military after Vietnam ceased to use out of this concern. Second idea of a credibility gap came out of the secret war in Laos and Cambodia. Even as the United States was de-escalating the number of troops in Vietnam, President Nixon was expanding the war into the countries to the immediate west of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. Now, this was a secret war only in the sense that it was not officially acknowledged by the United States government, but it was pretty well understood by the public that this is exactly what was taking place. There were a handful of very, very specific incidents that captured the public's imagination. The image that you see on the top right there, this image is often called Napalm Girl. Napalm was a jelly-like sticky substance that was incendiary, meaning it would light on fire, and it would be dropped over areas where Viet Cong or Viet Minh were expected to be, but that also meant that the villagers who were there were often caught in the crossfire. The girl that you see before you, she had been covered in napalm and had torn off her clothes to try to get the burning sensation off of her. Images like this began to call into question the minds of the American public whether or not we were actually helping the population of South Vietnam, which is in theory what we were there to do. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, who had been a subcontractor for the Defense Department, began releasing previously classified information to the New York Times and the Washington Post that went back over the history of Vietnam and exactly how the United States had gotten into the predicament it was in by 1971. And what it demonstrated to the public when it was released is that a lot of the concerns that were showing up in 1968 and 1969 were the same concerns that the United States government had in 1963 and 64 and even long before that. So this credibility gap that already existed, the Pentagon Papers in a sense confirmed what the American public had been thinking, that their own government had not been very straightforward about what was taking place in Vietnam itself. And this last image at the bottom right is the aftermath of the shooting of 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio. The Vietnam War was marked by massive protests against the war all across the country. This one, however, resulted in the United States National Guard opening fire and killing 4 college-age protesters. So once again, for Americans, there was this question for them of who exactly is the United States government supporting? Why are we taking these steps in Vietnam that ultimately are leading to deaths on the streets of the United States itself? In a moment, you're going to, and this will be posted in Google Classroom, you're going to hear a handful of minutes of audio tape between President Johnson and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. And these tapes, I believe, run from 1963 into 1968. And they are private conversations. They are not public conversations. Well, they are now. But they're private conversations that largely are showing these internal questions and debates that were going on outside of the view of the public. So what you're going to be listening for when you listen to these clips is how does their own conversation, their internal conversation, possibly support the idea of a credibility gap that would show up later on in the Vietnam War.